or circle dancing. We may have to be apart as well. So look for Susan's publicity. She's a fabulous publicist. She always makes us sound so good. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Peggy. It's a wonderful job that Peggy and her committee do. There are refreshments in the barn, and there's a little gift shop where they're selling these lovely Woodbridge Farmstead mugs for $10. I do not get a commission. You can. And some cookbooks, t-shirts, etc. I also would like to introduce my friend and neighbor, George Borgard. He's sitting under the tree with a blue shirt on. He was kind enough to drive me over to the Woodbridge Farmstead today in his 1963 Thunderbird, which you are welcome to come and take a look at. It's a little bit of a mash-up today, a mash-up where you're combining things. The 18th century barn, the 1963 car, but most important today, the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, votes for women. It was on August 18th of 1920 that 3/4 of the states were ratifying, and on August 18th, they finally got to 3/4 of the states ratifying. Connecticut was not one of them, but we ratified it in September, but by then it was already an amendment. So, as town historian, I have the opportunity to speak at various places and to listen to the wonderful memories that people have. Oh, I used to come by this. I never was able to go in there. Here now it's open to the public. It's so wonderful. And other memories that maybe are not so good. And I'll tell you about one of them. A friend of ours. This was in the 1970s. We're not talking about 1910. The 1970s. She was a single high school teacher, pretty well paid for the 1970s. By then, women teachers were getting paid the same as men. Don't take anything for granted. That was not true as late as the 1960s. Anyway, she could not get a mortgage to buy a house. She could not get a mortgage. And she actually came to my husband, Malcolm Barlow, who's an attorney, and she said, "What can I do? They're just turning me down." And they would not say, "It's because you're a woman." They just would say, "Oh, no, you don't qualify." So finally, he said, "Just keep going, keep going." At that time, there were many more banks. They didn't have the big merged up banks. So she eventually did get a mortgage.
In the 1970s, we bought our first home, my ex-husband and I. I was working full-time, and they didn't want to accept.
Oh, no, certainly not. Because you might go have a baby, and then you wouldn't be working and you wouldn't get money. A lot of things have changed for the better. So in this anniversary that we're celebrating this month, you might think it was a point in time, but it really wasn't a point in time. The struggle for equal voting rights went on really for centuries. And there were some countries that granted the vote to women in the 1600s, in the 1700s. And in the Native American cultures, which were a little bit more maternalistic, women not only were a part of the decision-making, they were a part of the government, if you want to call it government, of how the tribe or how the organization was going to operate. But it wasn't one point in time. July 20th, 1848 was the first convention for women's rights. It opened in Seneca Falls, New York. There's a lovely museum up there. If you kind of a day trip, I guess you could make it in a day. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the rest of the convention's organizers got to the place where the convention was going to take place. It was locked. You know, it was just like one thing after another. And of course, it was another 72 years before they actually got the vote. So as town historian of Manchester, I'm going to not just talk about the whole history, the timeline. I could bore you to tears. Really, you'd be having a nap in the afternoon. But my emphasis as Manchester's town historian is to bring it down to Manchester. So, quiz. What year was Manchester incorporated?
I have no idea. Tell us.
1823. Is there a prize for Dick Gordon? Very good. And we'll be celebrating our 200th anniversary in just 3 years, 1823. So I have this lovely article from the Hartford Courant. It happens to be dated 1823, June 10th, 1823. Some ladies wanted to incorporate a female-friendly society. Remember, back in the 1800s, without TV, movies, etc., they had fraternal organizations, and they had groups of people who would get together, religious organizations and non-religious organizations as well. So they went to the legislature, and here's how it was reported. A bill in form prepared by this committee, incorporating the Female-Friendly Society, was introduced and read. Messrs. Griswold and Co. said a few words in favor of it, because they wanted to have official status as an organization, and in commendation of the object of the association, which was to do good works within the town. However, Messrs. Hendy and Taintor gave their sentiments against the bill. They were opposed to the practice in principle and deemed it inexpedient. It would be one thing if this association were composed of maidens. It might not be too much of a difficulty, but if it were to consist of married ladies, it might be, by some persons, considered incompatible with many of their conjugal duties and constitute an insurmountable objection. They were turned down. They were not allowed to incorporate their female-friendly society. So we're moving through this timeline of maybe getting a little closer to votes and then coming farther back away. In the 1850s, 1860s, we were headed toward the Civil War, so votes for women took a little bit of a back seat at that time, and then began to reinvigorate in the 1870s. In fact, in 1874, Susan B. Anthony came and spoke at Cheney Hall right here in Manchester, Connecticut, on votes for women, along with her friend Isabella Beecher Hooker, you know, sister of the lady, the author lady. They didn't say that she was an author. They always said she was a lady author. She was a female author, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was an author. Anyway, I will be talking more about the timeline. But in the meantime, I want to talk a little bit about Horace Bushnell. Horace Bushnell, Bushnell Park, Bushnell Memorial, you know who I'm talking about. He was the minister of a congregational church, the biggest congregational church in Hartford. He ran into terrible difficulties. He was on trial with the congregational church for going off the deep end because he was against Calvinism, and he believed more along the lines of God is love. Well, that was considered, wait a minute. we are the chosen, right? And so what we would consider today to be pretty mundane, it was considered at the time to be heresy. And so he was on trial to see if he would be able to continue to be the minister of the church. He finally sort of won out, but a lot of his friends abandoned him. The reason I bring up Horace Bushnell, who's not from Manchester, his daughter, Mary Bushnell, married F.W. Cheney, Frank Woodbridge Cheney, and they had 12 children here in Manchester. They lived in a mansion called Old Red, which was on the Great Lawn. It's no longer there. Most of the Great Lawn mansions are still there, but that one isn't. They had 12 children, and the women were suffragists. So if that's any compensation or poetic justice or whatever. So in 1851, Horace Bushnell wrote The Age of Homespun. And I'm going to read to you from this book. You must not go into the burial places and look about only for the tall monuments and the titled names. It is not the starred epitaphs of the doctors of divinity, the generals, the judges, the honorables, the governors, or even of the village notables called esquires that mark the springs of our successes and the sources of our distinctions. These are rather effects than causes. The spinning wheels have done a great deal more than these. So you're getting the impression, the distaff, the spinning wheels, these are associated with women, and that it's not just the generals, etc. So wouldn't you think that with all his respect for women, that he would be for votes for women? In 1869, he wrote a book, Woman's Suffrage, a Reform Against Nature. He was very much opposed to women's votes. And I'll go into that a little bit later. But speaking now as town historian, I do want to say it is a little bit of a mashup today with the 1963 Thunderbird convertible, which doesn't really go with 1920, which doesn't really go with the 18th century. And now I'm talking a little bit about history in general. So one of the things that you probably all know this, nothing is simple. Nothing is simple. You think you know the answer, it turns out it's more complicated. Oh, in 1920 they got the vote. Well, actually, have you heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act? Chinese people were not allowed to be, immigrants were not allowed to become citizens, were not allowed to vote. Native Americans were not granted the vote until 1926. So, female or male, you did not have a constitutional right to vote if you were a Native American. And to go even further, until 1928, there were Western states who didn't allow Native Americans to vote anyway, even though it was the law, which we see now with voting anyway. Do you remember the poll tax? There used to be a poll tax in the South. If you couldn't pay your poll tax, you couldn't vote. So it was a way of keeping people down. So anyway, getting back to the age of homespun and Horace Bushnell, he said in that book, what we call history, considered as giving a record of notable events or transactions under names and dates. Isn't that kind of what we think of as history? The names, the dates, the events. And so the exhibition of the causes that construct a social state, I consider to be commonly very much of a fiction. He is saying what we kind of know. It's not just the events, it's not just the dates. There's a lot more going on. It's a process of how we achieved votes for women, how we achieved votes for Native Americans. That was written in 1851. I think it's still fresh today, all you historians out there. It is my pleasure to introduce Bill Ludwig, the town of Manchester historian, troubadour, who's going to sing, yay, round of applause please, a vintage song. This was, oh that's all right. The sheet music was published in 1897. Daughters of Freedom, the ballot be yours. Let's all say that. Daughters of Freedom, the ballot be yours. It has words by George Cooper, who was a friend of Stephen Foster, and a prolific lyricist during the 1870s and 1880s. The composer of the music, Edwin Christie, was a composer who probably worked in the Boston area. So here's a little bit about the song itself. It reinforced a major argument of suffragist sympathizers. Notice I'm saying suffragist. Suffragist, not suffragette. Suffragette is a diminutive. It was actually an epithet. It was a way of putting women down. Oh, she's just a suffragette. So I'm going to say suffragist, who considered that women lacked the inherent capability to vote in a responsible manner. Their brains didn't work right or something. But the people who were for votes for women pointed out that men gave over the chore of raising children to their wives. If women were so muddle-headed that they could not cast a vote properly, then what were men doing in allowing them to bring up their children? We also have the cover here of the sheet music, and we'll be here. I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes or so, but I'll be here until George wants to take his Thunderbird back home. And if you have any questions or you want to take a look at the music. The suffragists also argued that women wanted the vote not to overturn society and take over, but so that they could become better mothers and vote for such things to protect children as laws would guarantee the purity of the milk supply and, maybe less alcohol out there and possibly an older age that kids would have to be before going into work in the factories. A lot of child labor back in 1897. So thank you very much, Bill.
My pleasure. Daughters of freedom, arise in your might. March to the watchwords, justice and right. Why will ye slumber? Wake, awake. Lo, on your legions doth light doth break. Sunder the fetters custom hath made, come from the valley, hill and glade. Daughters of freedom, the truth marches on. Yield not the battle till ye have won. Heed not the corner till day by day clouds of oppression roll away. Sunder the fetters custom hath made, come from the valley, hill and glade. Daughters of freedom, the ballot be yours. Wield it with wisdom, your hopes it secures. Rights that are equal to this ye claim. Right light by your guerdon, fair your flame. Sunder the fetters custom hath made, come from the valley, hill and glade. Come from the valley, hill and glade.
Oh, that was wonderful. Have you ever been out on the website of the Library of Congress? You can listen to vintage songs right there on your computer. And in fact, Bill had to transcribe that. It had, you could listen to it, but it didn't show you how it was arranged, so he arranged it himself. There's nothing this man can't do. I'm just amazed. We'll hear from him again later on. So, getting back to Horace Bushnell, who published Women's Suffrage, The Reform Against Nature, he said, "My religious tracts became quite popular among some of the younger generation of ministers of the gospel, and some of the most famous of these, including Henry Ward Beecher." Recent book came out about Henry Ward Beecher, the most famous man in America. He was the most famous man in America when he was orating all around the country. Including Henry Ward Beecher, would give expression to my ideas from their pulpits. So these were the radical thoughts, that we weren't all going to hell, that maybe there was hope for us. Yet now I find I have offended another member of that illustrious clan, Mrs. Isabella Beecher Hooker. Remember I said she was speaking at Cheney Hall in 1874 with Susan B. Anthony about votes for women. And he said they were neighbors. With the Bushnells and the Beechers were neighbors. And he had offended another member of that illustrious clan after he published Women's Suffrage, The Reform Against Nature, in which I argued that giving women the vote was altogether unsuitable, and that women had a calling far higher and more significant than participation in politics. And that was one of the arguments against votes for women, that it would somehow sully them, or that they would not be the angels up on a pedestal if they got down into politics. There are many women who agree with me, and in fact, the most significant woman in my life, his wife, is a perfect example of what I was speaking about. Mrs. Hooker, however, has cast her lot with the radical women reformers who, in the name of dear equality, in quote marks, hope to bring women into every dreary and rough department of life now occupied by men. Alas, poor women! These reformers have such a romantic vision of the base existence of our half of the species. Thankfully, there is great opposition to women's suffrage in this society, although hardly from the sort I would care to identify myself with, or for reasons I would give. One of the segments of the population that was against votes for women was the liquor industry. They were afraid that, and women were very active in the temperance movement. There are pictures of, like Carrie Nation, they're smashing with their axes. But they were against drinking because of the suffering of families associated with men drinking. But it came down to money, because if you closed down the liquor industry, a lot of people would lose their jobs or whatever. So, and also mill owners who were using child labor. Oh, if women get the vote, what, their kids are going to have to be 16, 17 before they come to work. The suffrage is not the answer, though, in fact, I see it as only further demeaning women. I express these sentiments clearly in my book and look forward to clearing up any misunderstandings they may have caused when I converse with Mrs. Hooker. Don't you wish you could be there when they had that conversation? So if you're interested, you can go online read the entire book in Google Books, Woman's Suffrage, Reform Against Nature by Horace Bushnell. So this, usually I do slideshows, but obviously I can't do that out here, but this is a picture of a woman, very petite woman, almost childlike, I would say, riding her steed over a bunch of liquor barrels, and she has her axe. So is this what's going to happen? Oh no, oh no. Oh dear. I hope you have number 7 there. Thank you. Okay, all right. I hadn't planned on wind. So, bringing it back to Manchester once again, I'd like to talk about December of 1916. There was in Manchester an active, what we might call a League of Women Voters, but was called at the time, because there were no votes, you know what I mean? They couldn't be voters. The South Manchester Equal Franchise League. And they wanted to have a meeting with speakers in the high school auditorium. Now this is the old high school downtown Main Street. How many have been in that building? Yeah, it has a huge auditorium. And any organization in the town of Manchester could borrow that auditorium for concerts or events or speakers. But when the South Manchester Equal Franchise League wanted to use the auditorium, they were turned down. They were turned down. And here's the letter that they received. The president of the organization at the time, her name was Mrs. Henry J. Myrne. Remember, a woman didn't have a name like Susan. Her name was Mrs. Malcolm Barlow. The president of the school board, the 9th school district, his name was Howell Cheney, by the way, for whom the technical school is named, the one over on the way to East Hartford. Dear Madam, I find that you were entirely correct as regards my failure to send you a copy of regulations regarding the regulation of high school hall. I very much regret the oversight and hold myself responsible for any misunderstanding having arisen. Yours truly, Howell Cheney. So he's saying that there were regulations that had been published, and that's why they couldn't use the auditorium. The regulation which Mr. Cheney had charged the league with breaking, it was learned, had not been adopted by the school board, as it was expected that the regulation question would be voted upon at the next board meeting. It was voted to send an inquiry regarding the future attitude of the school board toward the league in its use of the hall. While Mr. Cheney's letter absolves the league from responsibility from breaking a regulation which didn't exist as yet, which did not exist, it did not settle the question of the future application of the regulation in case it should be adopted by the school committee, nor the question of the $10 rental, which no one else was charged a $10 rental, only the Equal Franchise League. $10 in 1916 was a substantial amount of money. Or the free use of the hall as granted to other organizations. The following letter was sent by special messenger, Mr. Howell Cheney, Chairman, 9th District School Committee. My dear Mr. Cheney, even when they were disagreeing, they were always, my dear Mr. Cheney, and they were always, oh, your obedient servant and all that. My dear Mr. Cheney, the South Manchester Equal Franchise League, by vote of the League, wishes the following question presented to the 9th District School Committee at its meeting this afternoon. Will the committee of the 9th School District allow the South Manchester Equal Franchise League the use of the high school hall on equal terms with other organizations. This went on in the Hartford Courant. You can read the Hartford Courant online back to 1762. This went on for days, back and forth. And eventually, guess what? They did get to use the hall. But I have a feeling that Mr. Howell Cheney was never very happy about that. Now, getting back to our own website, the website of the Manchester Historical Society, we have entire books. How many of you have ever looked at the website? Entire books. The history of Manchester, which has been out of print for years. You can read it online. Thanking Richard Speece, who scanned it. It's 300 pages long. That's a labor of love. Richard Speece, if you know the book I'm talking about, it was written by Speece and Bidwell. That was his grandfather. So, a labor of love. And in that we have the book Descent of the Founders of the Cheney Silk Industry, written by Dorothy Cheney. She was a volunteer in World War I. Maybe you've heard of that. A Red Cross nurse in World War I. A March 30th, 1916 article in the Hartford Courant notes that Dorothy Cheney was on the committee for an April 4th tea and sale of fancy articles at Tinker Hall. What might be fancy articles? Perhaps embroidered, I don't know, tea cozies or hemstitched. Isn't that hemstitching on your outfit? The open work. It's like a reverse of lace, where it's beautiful. Take a look at that later on. And anyway, they had their tea and sale of fancy articles at Tinker Hall, sponsoring an address by Emily Pearson, who was a very charismatic suffragist and quite an orator. Under the auspices of the Equal Franchise League, Dorothy Cheney was Horace Bushnell's granddaughter. So again, some poetic justice. October 1st of 1918 in the Manchester Herald. Oh, that's our new thing at the Historical Society website. You can read the Manchester Evening Heralds back to 1882. They've all been scanned. Talk to me later if you want to find out more about that. But anyway, October 1st, 1918, the president, Woodrow Wilson, asks for the passage of the Anthony Amendment, Susan B. Anthony, the Votes for Women Amendment, 19th Amendment, to the federal Constitution, providing for woman suffrage on the ground that it is a measure in the interest of worldwide democracy. By that time, many other countries had granted the vote to women. So we're looking like a bunch of chumps over here in North America not granting votes for women. The Netherlands, 1689, the Hawaiian Kingdom, 1840, Sweden in 1862, Finland in 1863, and then states in America, Wyoming, 1869, Colorado, 1893, Utah and Idaho in 1896, 1910, Washington State, 1911, California, and by 1918, the United Kingdom and Ireland. So we were a little behind the times. So getting back to this concept of history is not a bunch of dates and battles and events. It's really more a process. And when we look back at that process, we sometimes see a different pattern from what we grew up with. Remember the Paul Simon song, "When I think of all the crap I learned in high school, it's a wonder I can think it all"? We were taught that the Indians maybe came here like 2,000 or 3,000 years before the Mayflower. Well, now we're saying we can see, using DNA, using ground penetrating radar, carbon dating, The Native Americans were here 10,000, 14,000 years before. So history evolves when we have more data. But I'm bringing this book, The Story of America in Pictures, originally published in 1935, and then updated. The last update was in 1953. Do you think there are any women in this book? Do you think they mention 1920? The ratification of the No, not a peep out of them. But they do say some rather, what I would consider, shocking things. This picture, which you can't see, it's quite dark, the slaughter of the Pequots. As the colonists expanded, trouble with the Indians was inevitable. In 1637, stirred by a common enemy, the whites joined against the Pequots in an intercolonial war managed by the Massachusetts colony and the Connecticut towns. John Mason, maybe you've been reading about his statue that cannot seem to find a home, and John Underhill were the leaders. The Indians were cornered. Of some 400 men, women, and children, only 4 escaped alive. The Pequot tribe was extinguished by this, and a subsequent bloody slaughter which, although cruel, gained peace for the colony for many years. Gained peace for the colony for many years. It's shocking what they're saying here. And of course we know that the Pequots were not obliterated. They moved into the hills, they moved into the swamps. They were home to runaway slaves. They lived differently, but they were not extinguished. So I looked through for 1920, no, nothing. Mostly it's about battles, presidents, and purchases of land and inventions of equipment. Now, it is your pleasure to once again welcome Bill Ludwig, who is going to present this wonderful song. She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you. This is written by, well, the music was by Herman Paley, the lyrics by Alfred Bryan. Do you want to say anything else about it, Bill? Or?
I think you covered it. I think it was released in 1917.
I think so. I don't see it right now. I think it's 1917. I'll walk around.
I've now performed this song a couple of times, and I will tell you that it is one of my truly favorite songs of all time. At this point, I love it. No man is greater than his mother. No man is half so good. No man is better than the wife he loves. Her love will guide him, whatever beguile him. She's good enough to love you and adore you. She's good enough to bear your troubles for you. And if your tears were falling today, nobody else would kiss them away. She's good enough to warm your heart with kisses when you're lonesome and blue. She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you. Man plugs the world in war and sadness. She must protest in vain. Let's hope and pray someday we'll hear her pain. Stop all your madness, I bring you gladness. She's good enough to love you and adore you. She's good enough to bear your troubles for you. And if your tears were falling today, nobody else would kiss them away. She's good enough to warm your heart with kisses when you're lonesome and blue. She's good enough to be your baby's mother, and she's good enough to vote with you. She's good enough to give you old Abe Lincoln. She's good enough to give you Brandon Sherman, Robert E. Lee, and Washington too. She was so true, she gave them to you. She's good enough to give you Teddy Roosevelt, Thomas A. Edison too. She's good enough to give you Woodrow Wilson, and she's good enough to vote with you.
Thank you, Bill. That was amazing. Just amazing. Now, as a treat for you who have stuck it out in the heat, I'm going to read this speech of Susan B. Anthony's. It was delivered in 1873, starting in 1873 through 1874. She went around the country. In fact, she spoke in Connecticut 16 times with this speech. It was after she was arrested and tried and fined $100, which was a lot of money in 1872, for voting in the 1872 presidential election. She was going to go to jail. But it was continued. Her lawyers got it continued and continued. But she did go around the country, and she spoke at Cheney Hall. Isabella Beecher Hooker spoke with her. Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. It shall be my work this evening to prove to you that in thus voting, I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' rights guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution beyond the power of any state to deny. The preamble of the federal Constitution says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. It was we the people, not we the white male citizens, no offense, nor we the male citizens, but we the whole people who formed the Union. And we formed it not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women as well as men. And it is a downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this democratic Republican government, the ballot. For any state to make sex a qualification that must ever result in the disenfranchisement of one entire half of the people is to pass a bill of attainder or an ex post facto law, and is therefore a violation of the supreme law of the land. By it, the blessings of liberty are forever withheld from women and their female posterity. You could cheer here. Yes, 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 yes. To them, this government has no just powers derived from the consent of the governed. To them, this government is not a democracy. It is not a republic. It is an odious aristocracy, an oligarchy of sex, the most hateful aristocracy ever established on the face of the globe, an oligarchy of wealth where the rich govern the poor. The dictionary defines a citizen to be a person in the United States, entitled to vote and hold office. The only question left to be settled now is, are women persons? And I hardly believe any of our opponents will have the hardihood to say they are not. Being persons, then, women are citizens, and no state has a right to make any law or to enforce any old law that shall abridge their privileges or immunities. Hence, every discrimination against women in the constitutions and laws of the several states is today null and void. Go, Susan B. Anthony. Well, unfortunately, she didn't live to see 1920 and votes for women. So I have a couple other things I wanted to point out. There's a wonderful exhibit at the Connecticut Historical Society about votes for women. There's a very nice display in here of posters. Make sure you take a look at that. You can shop in the museum store over there. And also the Cheney Homestead is open today until 4. So you could hustle on over there. It's at 106 Hartford Road. Now, I'm sure all of you are looking for volunteer opportunities. Don't make eye contact with me. No, really. This is from the Library of Congress. What they are asking for volunteers for is to transcribe diaries and letters that were handwritten in cursive and to type them so that they can be read. And a great deal of this has already taken place with volunteers. The Mary Church Terrell papers, the Anne Dickinson, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton papers. People have been at their home typing and then verifying and maybe getting somebody else to proofread. So that's a wonderful opportunity to really be contributing to history. And then this is the little poster for the Connecticut Historical Society. So I expect that you'll all be going right home and getting on to that project. But thank you very much. Thank you to Bill for coming out today. Thank you for Peggy for hosting. Thank you to George for my wonderful chariot today.